My name is Allie. I am the Communications and Event Specialist here at Boston University's Institute for Global Sustainability. And on behalf of our IGS team, I want to thank you all so much for joining us today. Our focus here at IGS is powering research and conversation at the intersection of sustainability and equity. So it makes perfect sense that our very first author talk is with New York Times bestselling author and award-winning journalist Keith O'Brien. Keith's book, Paradise Falls, tells the powerful story of community advocacy in the face of environmental disaster, one of the worst in American history. We're delighted to welcome him and all of you for this important discussion today. Before we begin, I wanted to take a brief moment to thank our co-sponsors, the BU College of Communication and its new Center on Media Innovation for Social Impact, and the BU Initiative on Cities, as well as our promotional partners, the Center for Innovation in Social Science, the School of Public Health Department of Environmental Health, and the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. So, to kick things off, I'd like to invite David Abel to deliver some brief opening remarks. David Abel is an award-winning reporter, documentary filmmaker, and professor of the practice in journalism at BU College of Communication, an affiliated faculty here at IGS, and a friend of Keith O'Brien's.
That is the most important. Thank you, Allie, and welcome everyone. I am super happy to have my very good friend Keith O'Brien inaugurate this series of talks and to talk about his incredible piece of journalism called Paradise Falls. I have known Keith for about 20 years, since he moved to Boston from New Orleans, where he was a reporter at the Times-Picayune. And I first got a glimpse of his greatness from the dispatches he wrote for the Boston Globe in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. That work to me signaled that he was a serious reporter with a writer's eye for detail. Before the Globe hired Keith as a staff writer, he freelanced for the Globe's now defunct City Weekly, where I happened to be working as an editor. And we assigned Keith to write this weekly column called Heart of the City. And week after week, Keith filed these incredibly lyrical profiles about everyone from the guy who fired the starting gun to release the horses at Suffolk Downs, to a woman in Boston who made t-shirts for murder victims. And he reminded me in a text last night about this woman who he was nearly sued by in this really beautiful lead that I would call, but can't remember exactly the words, that she was very delighted. I think she was like a karate person, and she was very delighted about kicking someone in the face. Anyway, it was a very impressive lead. Being Keith O'Brien's editor is, as you can imagine, probably the easiest job you could have had. I had a front row seat to his genius, his ability to repeatedly find compelling stories and shed grace on them. He did that every week with just the right touch of humor or pathos or journalistic rigor, whatever it was that the story demanded. And then after the Globe had the wisdom of offering Keith a full-time job, we sat next to each other in the newsroom at the Globe in the Metro section, and I got a close-up view of how he does what he does. And that often, as anyone who knows him well, involves pulling his hair out at deadline, speaking often at preposterous volumes during phone interviews, and scrawling into a notebook the most granular and essential details that invariably gave his stories a signature depth and an emotional punch. After a few years of pumping out one front page story after another, Keith abandoned me at the paper, sadly. I remember the day that he told me he was leaving. I felt like a wounded girlfriend up with. But then I went on to watch him with little surprise and great pride as he went on to become an acclaimed best-selling author. The New York Times described his first book, Outside Shot, as, quote, a reporting tour de force. For me, someone who had absolutely no interest in the subject of that book, which was about high school basketball, and this one team from Scott County, Kentucky's quest for glory, I was immersed and I was just completely drawn in by the propulsive narrative and the way he so richly reported each of these players' lives and their lineage. He, needless to say, made the transition from news reporter to author seem effortless. After that book, he wrote a riveting narrative about female aviation in his book Fly Girls, which went on to become a New York Times bestseller. It was about the pioneering female pilots in the 1920s and 30s who fought for the right to fly and race planes at a time when women were not supposed to do that kind of thing. What astounded me about that book was how he managed to bring these long dead characters back to life, and how he managed to use microfilm, diaries, and a range of other records to rebuild their world with an artist's flair for gripping detail. One particularly esteemed professor by the name of Mitch Zukoff described Fly Girls as, quote, a soaring tribute to forgotten American heroes filled with white-knuckle thrills and gut-wrenching emotion. Keith's most recent bestseller, Charlie Hustle, is another astonishing feat of narrative storytelling, one close to his roots as he grew up in Cincinnati. It is a story about the rise and fall of Pete Rose, or as Keith describes him in the book, Icarus in red stirrup socks and cleats, the American dream sliding headfirst into third base, or the most ordinary, extraordinary athlete in the history of American sports. And it so happened to be fortunate that he published the book when he did, which was just a few months before Pete Rose died at the age of 83 in September. The book is so meticulously reported, it has 35 pages of footnotes. And I think most of his books have a similar breadth of footnotes, which I always find actually compelling to read. But we are here today to talk about what, in my opinion, is Keith's best or most compelling or most important book, and the one that somehow did not become a bestseller. Paradise Falls, the story of an environmental catastrophe, may not instantly lure readers in the way a story about a famous ball player consorting with mobsters might. But if you have not read this book, and I hope you all will, there are books outside here, it is breathtaking in its scope of reportage and in the visceral way he tells this story that I would say is almost cinematic. And I say this not because Keith is a friend, but because Paradise Falls repeatedly left me in tears, tears of outrage and tears of catharsis. And I require my students in my environmental journalism class to read this book because it tells a vital story about what really makes this country exceptional. And I say that for the good and for the bad. Paradise Falls is about a place called Love Canal, which is just east of Niagara Falls. and it was envisioned to be a kind of utopian community. Instead, a large, powerful company buried countless barrels of toxic waste there that ended up killing and harming an untold number of unsuspecting residents who lived in the area. The company then sought to cover up what they had done and denied responsibility for the harm that came from their chemicals. But this is also a story about what makes our country truly great. And that is how righteous protests, fearless scientists, well-intentioned public officials, and dare I say it, zealous reporters with what he describes in one case as ice cold, on the record glares, work to make things better, to right wrongs, and to somehow collectively eke out some measure of justice. Ultimately, this is a story about the dawn of the environmental movement, how light cast on one notorious environmental injustice gave rise to the nation's Superfund laws and a host of other vital environmental rules that now, or at least used to, before a few months ago, protect our air, water, and food from pollution and other malfeasance. In short, this is a story that very much resonates today at a time when we are seeing a new administration promise to scrap many of those rules and fire those who are charged with enforcing them. Keith, thank you so much for this book, and thank you for coming here to share this story. Now, please everyone welcome Stephanie Ettinger de Cuba, a professor in the School of Public Health and the executive director of Children's HealthWatch, who will lead the conversation with Keith. Thank you very much.
Everybody, it's great to see you. Thanks all for being here. As you said, I'm Stephanie Ettinger de Cuba. I'm a professor from the School of Public Health, School of Medicine, IGS affiliate faculty, and also an associate director with the Initiative on Cities, which is one of the co-hosts here. So, you know, I think part of the reason I was invited to be in this role was because of the past work that I've done. And I'll say a quick word to just connect it in. My work has always focused on very young children and their families and the ways that public policies and changes in the economy impact their health and development. And, you know, this book kind of is a beautiful example of that. In particular, it focused on mothers and their health and well-being, and really aiming to bring truth and data to decision makers to try and help them make better evidence-informed decisions about policy. And that sort of, you know, has always been as in partnership with communities as well, very much, you know, working directly grassroots with moms who are experiencing whatever policy we were advocating about, whether it was safety net programs or we were talking about food insecurity or housing instability, and bringing that directly to policymakers at City Hall here in Boston or at the State House, or actually also on Capitol Hill. And sitting side by side with them to make the data case and then also make the real life on the ground, what does this look like in my life case. And this book, I think, underscores the value of those two parts coming together, and how you know, there's so much more that can be done when we're really in deep partnership with communities. Yeah, and I think a really interesting story about holding government accountable and corporations as well. So I'll stop there. But great to meet you in person.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I have imposter syndrome after David's introduction.
But I wondered if you said a little bit about the story itself, but maybe for those who haven't read the book, set the stage a little bit for us and kind of help us understand the scene before we dive into more about the story.
I think the two words Love Canal have a certain resonance for people of a certain age. When I was working on the book, I realized that when I said what I was doing to people who were over the age of 45, they were like, oh yeah, I sort of know what that is. And people under the age of the 45 had no idea what I was talking about. It was like a cutoff point. But I think most people don't know what it is. And I think the better way to think of it is not as this mysterious place called Love Canal, but as a working class neighborhood of starter homes, the kind of homes that young working class families were able to purchase in the 1960s and 70s. This was a neighborhood that had a different name. It was called LaSalle, and it was about 6 miles east of the waterfalls that we all know so well. So this place exists since Niagara Falls exists. But it gets this name Love Canal from a man named William T. Love. So in the late 1890s, a developer, grifter, man by the name of William T. Love shows up in Niagara Falls, and he wants to create this model city. That's what he calls it. And he has an idea that that it's not his own, to basically create a cutoff in the Niagara River between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. So going around the waterfalls. It would have been great for ship traffic. It would have been a great way to generate electricity. Other people had this idea. William T. Love tries to build this canal. It's going to have to be 11 miles long, built into the escarpment of northern New York. It's an incredibly difficult job today. It's impossible then. He gets about a half mile, runs out of money, runs out of determination, and this jagged, leftover, dead-end canal of nowhere sits there in LaSalle. It sits there for decades. No one does anything with it. Children play and swim in the remnants of the old Love Canal. In the 1940s, one of the most prominent companies in Niagara Falls, a company called Hooker Chemical, begins to need a place to store, or rather dump, its chemical residues and wastes. Hooker Chemical is one of the earliest chemical manufacturers in America. It's a leading chemical manufacturer, does everything from the chemicals we need to treat our leather shoes, to pesticides for crops, to a chemical called thionyl chloride, which is the fundamental chemical in mustard gas. It acquires the old Love Canal. It begins to use it as a dumping site. It dumps about 20,000 tons of chemical waste and residues into this old canal over the course of a decade. And then as the city of Niagara Falls is growing and growing in the post-war years, the city is looking for a new place to build a school. And they reach out to Hooker Chemical to inquire about the use of the old Love Canal as its site. And, I went through the records, both at the New York State Archives in Albany and down in Washington, D.C. And you see the memos going back and forth in late 1952 and early 1953 inside Hooker Chemical. White, powerful men, and that's who they were. They were white, powerful men talking about this possibility. And initially they say, no, hard no, no way. We don't even know what's in that canal, But as the memos go back and forth over that winter and into the spring of 53, they begin to mention a second possibility, a second problem, really, which is the encroaching number of houses moving east out of Niagara Falls, closer to their canal, which is why the city wants to build a school there in the first place. And so they essentially broker a deal, and they are willing to give the land to the city for $1 so long as they write into the deed that Hooker Chemical will never be responsible for any problems that might exist as a result of that land. And that's really where the problem begins. And that's, you know, when these people who are the fundamental protagonists in my book are moving into this neighborhood in the 60s and 70s, they are moving into LaSalle. They've never heard of Love Canal. They want their children to go to that school, built on this very large playground on which there are no houses for a strange reason. And no one even knows about Love Canal until the problems are seeping into their basements.
That's great. Thank you. Helped set the scene very nicely. What got you, I mean, this is a story, like I heard about this as a kid and then learned about it again in high school. What got you interested in trying to retell the story? Because you bring in, and I'd love you to talk about that as well, some characters, protagonists, people in this story that just never got any other attention. So what sparked it for you?
Yeah, so, David mentioned before in his introduction that I wrote a book called Fly Girls. That was about female aviators in the 20s and 30s. It's essentially a story of Amelia Earhart and her friends. We have a tendency, specifically with women's history, to celebrate one woman, one great female scientist, one great female aviator. At the time Amelia's flying, there's this cadre of women flying with her, and they were all forgotten. And I wanted to rebuild that world. And of course, they were all gone, right? There was no one to interview there. And some of those women that were my protagonists in that book had lived into the late 1970s. Amelia herself, had she not disappeared, could have easily lived into the 1970s or 80s. Think about that for a second. And yet, no reporter, no historian had gone and found these women. They were just living right there, and no one would interview them. And so when I came out of that book, I was thinking about that and thinking about, who are the people around us right now who are maybe in their 70s or 80s, who maybe once did something great and we've sort of forgotten them. And that's where it started. And I just started sort of going down rabbit holes, as writers tend to do. I do have an interest in the environment. I was interested in telling an environmental story. And sort of just started going down the Love Canal rabbit hole and started making phone calls to women who were still alive, who had lived in that neighborhood as stay-at-home moms, or as they would have called them in the 1970s, as housewives. And really just started doing phone interviews with them, and that's really where it began.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, so I would imagine, what was the reception you got? And like building trust with these women, getting a phone call out of the blue. How did you sort of convince them that you were doing something that they should be part of?
Well, Love Canal, and people in this room will understand this from their own research, right? There are moments in people's lives that are sort of a before and after moment, where nothing is the same again. That is the dividing line. When my child got lead poisoning, that is the before and after moment, right? Love Canal is an ultimate before and after moment. They lose everything. They lose their investments. They lose their homes. They're trapped inside these homes for 2 years, trying to escape their own neighborhood that they wanted to live in the first place. It is a before and after. So, you find that some people, of course, want to talk about those moments, and other people you find that painful. In this story, I realized early on that it had never been written about the right way, in my opinion. I think all too often, with environmental storytelling in particular, we can get lost in the weeds and the science and the numbers and the chemicals and get distracted from what is the important story, which is the human story. And so, that's how I wanted to come at this. And my first phone call was to the only activist or mother in that neighborhood who did gain a measure of fame as a result of her activism, and that was a woman named Lois Gibbs, who became a fairly prominent activist as a result of her activism in her neighborhood. And a lot of, Love Canal narratives often go around Lois, but again, sort of like with Amelia, Lois wasn't doing that alone. There was this group of people. There were 1,000 families in that neighborhood. So you've got dozens of active families trying to get out. And so I talked to Lois, and then I brought in wider, and I talked to a woman named Luella Kenny, and Luella lived just north of the canal. This old canal, which was again now a school and a very large rectangular playground, because they did not build homes on the canal. They built a school, but not homes. And Luella lives just north of it, at an intersection of 3 creeks that are flowing off the Niagara River and off of the old canal itself. And Luella was compelling to me because one thing you have to look for when you're telling stories is not just the humans, but the people who had something at stake. Who are the people with the most at stake here? And I wanted to find and talk to Luella because she was obviously that. One of her 3 boys, the youngest of her 3 boys, becomes sick right about at the same time when the chemicals are really seeping out of this old landfill. And it was really after that phone call with Luella that I realized that there was something here, something that hadn't been told. And at that point, I began to make reporting trips, going to Western New York, going to the archives in Albany at the State Archives, going to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. And, Love Canal is one of the most litigated environmental disasters in American history. There are still court cases pending right now around Love Canal. And so, there are thousands and thousands of pages of documents, hundreds and hundreds of boxes of documents that I began to go through as I was, also doing the interviews with folks.
Yeah, actually, the Luella was the story. Her son eventually dies, and it was a part of the book that was really, really challenging to read. As a parent, I had to put the book down and walk away because it was very upsetting. The details in this book are so incredibly visceral and moving. And I wondered whether that made you want to dig in more and like all these details on the sort of like the human stories, or whether it was hard at points for you to sort of keep going with it as yourself.
Oh, I mean, it was absolutely hard. I mean, I'm a parent as well. And it's impossible. Anytime I'm writing about anything, probably like a lot of you start to live inside whatever you're researching, when I was writing Fly Girls, I'm dreaming I'm flying, I'm on planes. When I was writing this book, I was thinking a lot about chemicals, a lot about what was in my water at my house,
right?
What was in the creek behind my house. You start to think that way when you're living with people who were thinking that way. And it's one thing that was really helpful, about Luella, who, by the way, is still alive and in her late 80s now, and still an activist in Western New York today. And this is, of course, an ultimate before and after moment for her. As you said, her young son will die of a very rare kidney disease called nephrotic syndrome, which at the time Luella was told was just something that sometimes happens to people, because, of course, just like every ailment, asthma, cancer, etc., sometimes it does just happen. However, there have been many medical studies done over the years on nephrotic syndrome, this very rare and chronic kidney disease. And primarily, this disease shows up in 2 cohorts. It shows up in factory workers who work with hydrocarbon solvents like paints and paint thinners. And it shows up in lab rats who have been exposed to hydrocarbons and elements like paint thinners. And here is this boy with this problem in his house on the north end of this old chemical landfill on a property containing these creeks, with all of this runoff. And when I'm interviewing Luella, we're talking about that, but one of the first things I asked her before I came to Western New York is, what did you keep? Do you have anything? Do you have John Allen's medical records? Did you keep a journal? And of course, Luella had saved everything, because you do not, throw out the medical records from your children, even when they're fine, right? You don't. And so she had it all, and so here was this tick-tock, a time span from 1978 when these problems are starting to seep to the surface and her son is starting to go downhill. And so, it was obviously upsetting, but also I'm there in Luella's house in Western New York, scanning these medical records with my phone. And I know in that moment, that without question, I'm going to be able to tell this story, bring John Allen back to life on these pages, as a result of what she had kept.
Yeah, that's amazing. Actually, David reads the footnotes. I read the acknowledgements in every book because I think it's fascinating how people think. And that was actually, the acknowledgements are also very interesting, by the way. There's all this detail about all the places that he went to get documents, the archives and the people that helped him and the people that helped open doors and that sort of thing. So I think, it was fascinating to sort of trace your journey to even, get all the material that you needed to write this. Yeah, I mean, that sort of brings me to some of the records that were redacted and the sort of, roadblocks you hit. So I wondered if you might want to talk about that and sort of like you were mentioning the other week that there were records that had been, partially marked out and go ahead. Anyway, you tell the story, not me.
Well, that's great. That's great. So, there's this neighborhood of 1,000 families. They're working class families. Lois Gibbs in particular barely graduates from high school. She gets the equivalent of a GED in the 1960s. Lois is the kind of person who in the 70s didn't even speak up at PTO meetings, didn't want to talk at teacher conferences, had low self-confidence, and now these families are thrust into this situation. And just down the road from Niagara Falls in Buffalo was a public health researcher by the name of Beverly Kagan, and she works for a state lab that's affiliated with the University at Buffalo. And Beverly, by the way, founded Earth Day in Buffalo in the 1970s. She was a member of the Sierra Club. And she did a lot of groundbreaking research in the early 70s as a woman that people disagreed with at the time. Specifically, Beverly did a big study that suggested that secondhand cigarette smoke was harmful for our health. So when this problem emerges 20 minutes away, she's curious and starts to go out there on her own doing soil testing. And the mothers in the neighborhood learn about her and they begin to reach out to her for help. And Beverly, again, has no stake in this fight. She lives in a very nice neighborhood in Buffalo. She has her own children, but this is not her job to come here and study this, except she's interested. And of course, she wants to help when they ask. And, Beverly helps greatly these women, gives them a vocabulary to use with the press. Does epidemiological research, teaches them how to do epidemiological research on their own, and then how to crunch those numbers, and really helps them come up with almost a counterpoint to what the state is telling them, which is initially, you're fine, everything's fine, we're going to evacuate these 200 homes, but the rest of you are fine. Beverly knows early on that she's doing this at a cost to herself. Again, the lab she works for in Buffalo is a state lab. And the state health officials have evacuated at this point 200 homes, and they're going to purchase these homes. But they're telling the other 800 families, you're good. And Beverly's doing research that is suggesting we don't think so. And here's why. And she begins to believe, that she's being followed. She begins to believe that people are opening her mail at work in a threatening act that we can imagine today here in 2025. Her funding begins to dry up. Her proposals begin to get denied. And so all of this is happening to her. And, I tracked down Beverly as well. Beverly was in her early 80s when I found her. She lived for the last 30 years of her life in Bar Harbor, Maine. I live in New Hampshire. It was a 4-hour drive. I go up, I spend a couple of days with Beverly. And, on my visit there, my first visit, she said, I kept a lot of things, from this time. I said, well, what are we talking about? And she takes me to her closet in her office, her home office. And there are 4 file cabinets filled with Love Canal memos, letters, notes, her research. So I am now staying in Bar Harbor, and I'm scanning. And one thing that I always do when I'm working on any big story, book or big story, is when you're in an archive somewhere and you're there to say pull the Love Canal litigation files. I'm also going to do a search in that place for other key people in my story. I'm going to search Lois Gibbs. I'm going to search Luella Kenny. I'm going to search Beverly Pagan, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm doing this at National Archives in College Park, Maryland. I'm doing this in the courthouses in New York. I'm doing this at the archives in Albany. And one day in Albany, when I'm there, I type in Beverly's name, and a file does come up. And it's a small file. It's not a whole box or anything. It's one folder, which still could be hundreds of pages. And it said Beverly Pagan employment file. So I requested it. And my request was denied. And I was told this was a personal matter, and I could not have access to those records. So I had Beverly request the file, and then I also filed a Freedom of Information request to get the file. And this was all happening during COVID. I started my research in 2019. I'm doing this research in 2020. You all know how difficult that was. And so it takes 10 months to get a response to my Freedom of Information request. And I finally get that request, and they tell me they're sending me a disc with the file. And it comes in the mail, and there are about 300 pages on this disc. And, as I said, Beverly, told me, that she was being followed and she was being watched, and she thought her phone was tapped. And there was no specific evidence of that in those files. But what I can say definitively is that all the way to the doorstep of the governor of New York, all the way to the most powerful men in New York in 1978 and 1979, they were talking about Beverly. They were tracking where she was going and what she was doing. They wanted to know who she was talking to when she got there. And when those files came to me, they were still clearly so worried about what they were saying back and forth to Beverly that those 300 pages of memos and letters back and forth to each other were heavily redacted.
Crazy. All those years later, that they're still.
It is crazy, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, Beverly was, on their watch list because she was so persistent in going after this, but also, as you say, partnering with the families in the community so closely. And I wondered if you might say a little bit about why you thought their sort of grassroots group was so effective. Tell them a little bit about it.
Yeah, so, I personally learned a lot about activism from from doing this book. As I said, Lois initially was very hesitant to take a position out front because she was, she lacked so much self-confidence. But in the weeks before the state makes the first evacuation, Lois has gone to the school district with a very small question and request for her principal and her superintendent. Her oldest son had just begun to attend kindergarten at that school on that old hooker landfill buried in the Love Canal. And when Michael Gibbs begins to attend school there, he is completely healthy, no problems. But by Christmas of that year, he is now suffering from seizures. And so, again, Lois is told children sometimes do suffer from seizures. There's medication for that. They sometimes grow out of that. That is the process we're following here. And while Lois is getting that news, congressional aide from Western New York and a reporter for one of the local papers is beginning to dive into what is really happening at that school and starting to write stories about it. And Lois reads one of these stories buried deep inside the paper about a potential landfill underneath the 99th Street School. And she takes it to the school district and basically says, hey, listen, I don't feel comfortable with my son attending school there. He's got seizures. He didn't have them before. I request that he be moved to a different school in the fall of '78. Simple request. And, I often wondered, how history would be different if they had just satisfied
it, right?
Exactly. But they don't. They tell her, no, your son is fine. They deny the request. So Lois now begins to go door to door in the neighborhood. This is where it begins. Going door to door in the neighborhood, telling the neighbors what is happening here and asking them to sign a petition to shut down the school until we can learn more. That's what Lois wants. And while she's working for that, the state decides that the problem is bigger than that. And they are going to shut down the school. And they are also going to evacuate the 200 homes closest to the school. And at that point, Lois is now enraged. And she finds something that is very important. And I think is important to activists in general. Her plain spokenness is what connected with people. Everybody in this room, of course, knows, Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, and that is without a question the beginning of the environmental movement in America, in the 1960s. But when this story is starting in '78 in a working class neighborhood like LaSalle, they would have looked, down their noses at people who were marching, for the environmental movement. This, was a union lunch pail factory worker, neighborhood. That neighborhood in the '70s voted Democratic, but today that neighborhood would vote for Trump. And so, this movement, this environmental movement at the time was still very much an East Coast, West Coast liberal progressive thing. And what Lois and the women in this neighborhood do is they, with their outspokenness and their willingness to put themselves on the line again and again and again, willingness to be arrested, willingness to go to jail. They show people across America now they're making national news that this isn't an East Coast West Coast issue. This issue of the environment is an every person issue, and they really make it something more tangible for everybody.
Yeah, and I mean, what they launched from that is quite amazing. I wonder if you could just say a little bit too about how this connects in with Superfund legislation. That was also a big sort of, story in this book as well as the sort of what was happening in parallel on the policy level.
I mean, honestly, nothing captures more about how we have changed as a country than the story of the Superfund Act. That even that title, Superfund, it just came out of casual conversations on Capitol Hill. You know, with the publicity that Lois and Luella and Beverly were driving to their neighborhood in Niagara Falls. A couple of other neighborhoods in other parts of the country started to pop up with similar problems. They were built on the edge of munitions dumps or other dumps. And sometimes these companies were long gone, right? These were problems that had been buried in the ground decades ago. And so they were orphaned sites. Who would even begin to clean them up? Who would you even sue? They're all gone. And so they began to discuss on Capitol Hill the need for a giant sum of money, a super fund of money that could exist in perpetuity, funded by taxes on chemical and petrochemical companies. And in a scene that's impossible to imagine in 2025. You know, this process to get this passed begins in 79. But this is the Superfund Act is one of the largest pieces of legislation ever passed by Congress. And it takes about a year and a half to get the money in place, the taxes in place, the votes in place. And what has happened in that year and a half from March of 79 to say November of 80? Well, a political sea change, you know, and in November and December of 1980, in the lame duck session of Congress, after Jimmy Carter has lost in a landslide, and President-elect Ronald Reagan is coming in, absolutely unwilling to support this new Superfund legislation. A bipartisan group of legislators pass it in the Senate and the House, and it's signed by Carter in December 1980. It would simply never happen today. You had Republican congressmen and senators working with Democrat Republicans and senators, negotiating with petrochemical companies for this tax that would fund this super fund that would exist to clean up these orphan sites. I mean, we can't even determine the time of day right now in Washington, much less pass this kind of legislation.
Yeah, well, I mean, since you brought it up, what do you think about this story and what, like, the lessons we learned from this in light of all that's going on today? And what do you hope readers will take from it in this current climate?
You know, I probably, like a lot of you, you know, when it comes to global sustainability, and when it comes to big existential problems like climate change, you know, I oscillate back and forth between, you know, panic and fear and a desire to do something. And sometimes I can feel those same feelings in the same, you know, 3-minute time span. You know, spending time with these women and telling this story, you know, I learned something I think very important. You know, everyone is willing to fight for something when the problem feels real and tangible and beneath your own house. And when they felt that, the residents of this neighborhood, you know, they were willing to go out and get arrested. They were willing to follow the governor of New York wherever he went. They were willing to dog President Carter, to take an interest in what was happening in this small working class neighborhood in Niagara Falls. And they were willing to do it again and again and again at a time when their lives were incredibly difficult. They were moms of young families, children ages 4 and 6 and 8, now displaced from their own homes, living in hotels, total madness, right? Some of their marriages will not survive, you know, this time in their lives because of all the stress. And in that moment, they were willing to do those things because the threat was beneath their house, right? And I think, you know, what we need to communicate as science writers, as storytellers, as public policy workers, as doctors, is that the threat is beneath our house. And if you are willing to put yourself on the line again and again and again, change can come, but it will take that. It absolutely will take that kind of sacrifice, probably from all of us.
Yeah, and I think also another sort of theme of this book is also alliance building across groups that maybe like wouldn't have come in contact with each other otherwise. There were renters and homeowners that came together, people across different social strata, and all ended up in the streets advocating for this. So I wonder if that's something you could say a bit more about too.
I mean, without question. I mean, it's always about alliances, and you have again. This was an integrated neighborhood. Black and white. The little league teams in this neighborhood were black and white. The classroom there at the 99-3 school, was fully diverse. And those populations didn't always get along, of course, in the 70s. But when this threat was beneath their own homes, they absolutely did. They did come together. You have the partnerships between the residents and scientists, Beverly Pagan. There were also others. And fundamental too was alliances between the neighborhood and politicians.
Yeah.
One of the most shocking things to me is that this was an open secret in Niagara Falls. If you were in power in Niagara Falls in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, you absolutely knew why there weren't homes built right around that school. You knew, but you had to be in power to know those things. I think, again, as storytellers, when we come, especially to tell disaster stories, I think we all too often tell that story beginning with the disaster, but I think it's important to show what a place was before the disaster was there.
Yeah.
Which is why my narrative begins like a year and a half before these problems are seeping to the surface, because we can only care about a place when we know why people valued it to begin with. And so they absolutely made partnerships to save themselves, and political partnerships were important because a great number of those politicians did not want to come out there until one started to. And then once that one was there and understood it, because there's nothing like understanding a problem and standing in someone's basement and watching the chemicals or unidentified liquids seep through a cement foundational wall, right? Now you've got a problem, and now you're advocating for that.
Yeah, that's actually a great place now to open it up to all of you, where we have a Q&A for all of you. So questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing your book. I'm excited to read it. I'm curious, you mentioned just in passing about some of the media coverage and it was a little bit varied. Can you expand a little bit more about what the news coverage of this was?
Yeah. So, in my interviews, I try to interview as many people as I could who live in the neighborhood, right? And as a result, ended up interviewing a lot of kids who grew up in the neighborhood, right? Because they were 12 at the time in the 60s or 70s, and now they were much older. And one thing that came up time and again in these interviews, people would say, yeah, I used to play on that playground, and there were rocks there that would burst into flames. And I thought, well, that's, people tell you crazy things, right? Especially when you're talking about a story 50 years on, stories get embellished. It happens. I can sometimes interview 5 people who were in the same room at the same time, and you can come out with 5 different stories, right? So when people start saying, well, yeah, we played with rocks and caught on fire, I thought that can't be, right? It can't happen. And then one day I was in the library in Niagara Falls, working the microfilm machine, spinning it from day to day, and up pops up a story from about 1967. So we're about 11 years prior to the problems really seeping to the surface in the neighborhood. And there was a story inside the Metro page of the Niagara Gazette that said that the principal of the 99th Street School had alerted authorities that a child had found a rock on the playground that had burst into flames inside his pocket. And they, the gist of this very short article was that they wanted to alert residents of the hazard and offer some guidance that if they find such a rock, that they should bury it or submerge it into water. And, you know, I mentioned before, I have two kids, they're both boys. I live in New Hampshire. You know, we have a small piece of woods out behind our house. I can assure you that if my boys found rocks in that neighborhood or that forest that could burst into flames, it would be the greatest thing they ever found, right? They would not bury that. They would not submerge that in the water. This would be the greatest thing. So this is the kind of stories that were told, you know, in the 60s. And then it was a reporter by the name of Michael Brown, who comes new to the job in the 70s. And is covering a different problem at a planning board meeting in a town outside the city. And at that planning board meeting, residents were there to complain about a chemical storage area in their town that was approved and was giving off fumes and odors. And a woman spoke that night, who was not from that neighborhood, not from that town, who said tearfully at the podium during public comments that she hoped that the problems in this little town wouldn't get as bad as they are in our neighborhood in LaSalle. And Michael Brown was young and ambitious, and he was listening. You know, I've and David have, you know, covered in our younger days those board meetings. You know, it's late at night. You're there for the one issue. Often, if anybody's ever attended these kind of meetings, you got to wade through all the other issues. Reporters and residents fall asleep out in those meetings at times. Michael Brown was awake. He was listening, and he went back to the paper the next day, and he pulled the clip morgue. At every newspaper in those days, there was what was known as the clip morgue. Every newspaper had a librarian who would clip the newspaper stories out of the paper every day and then put them in a file folder labeled to that issue. So if you wrote about, say, an issue of rocks bursting in flames in LaSalle, that could be photocopied and put into the LaSalle folder. It could also be photocopied and put into like environmental hazard folder. And, you know, when I started in newspapers, I loved going to the clip morgue because there were no digitized newspapers. If you wanted to find the old clips of the Globe, you went to clip morgue, you pulled the file cabinet, you pulled the files on what you were writing about, and suddenly the past was born to life. That's what Michael Brown does. Suddenly, lots of little stories about problems in the neighborhood begin to add up. He goes out, he starts asking questions, and that's really where it begins from a point of view of informing the neighborhood of what was happening there.
I have two questions. My first question is, I'm curious how you organize all of your research and what you would suggest when you have so much information from the archives and interviews, and what works best for you.
Well, I wish I could say that I'm like super organized and I have this great system. You would not want to see my office when I'm in the midst of writing a book. You know, these days, most of what I can gather is digitized, right? Like even the scans of Luella's son's medical records, I'm scanning them on my phone. I'm connecting to Luella's Wi-Fi. I'm uploading them to the cloud or a Dropbox, and I'm moving on. 100 scans, move on. 100 scans, move on. What I do once I have, you know, the interviews, the transcripts of the interviews, and the scans, is I've now got just a mess of folders on my desktop, and I try to organize it thematically or chronologically. And so, you know, when I'm writing, I'm constantly going back to the tapes, which again are now living on my desktop. I'm going to the transcripts, which are living on my desktop, and then I'm going to the newspaper stories or the scans of court documents that are living on my desktop. And it's, you know, sometimes you might write, especially with this book. I mean, you know, again, I'm trying to write about science and chemicals in a way that my mom would want to read, right? And so I have to do that accurately, but I have to do that in language that is not being used in the files that I might be using. And so, and meanwhile, you know, because again, this was one of the most litigated cases in the history of the state of New York, the history of America, environmental cases. And again, it's still litigious today. I gotta be accurate, I gotta be right. I can't get it wrong. And so with the writing of this book, some days I might have only written like 2 paragraphs, you know, if I'm writing about the moment when Luella has the data, or sorry, Beverly has the data, and now she's explaining it to the residents, and then they're going out and talking about that. Wow, that could be like 2 really hard paragraphs to write. And you know, I'm constantly just going back and forth to my desktop to do that.
My other question is, when you're reconstructing scenes from the archives, what sort of details do you look for?
So, you know, if you read the book, there's an opening scene that's like a flashback, 1972. And you know, I mentioned before, I was really drawn to the idea that people in power knew this existed, but the people without power did not. And so, you know, as you have to think very critically about how you start a book, right? People judge a book by its cover, but if you're like me, if you're not hooked by the 5th or 7th page, I might be moving on, right? My time's too valuable, you know. There are too many other things to read. So you have to think very critically about how to start. And I realized that I did want to start with one of these moments that revealed the problem, the scope of the problem, not just the chemical problem, but that everybody knew except for the people who didn't. And there was a memo that I found. And I found it at the National Archives down in College Park, Maryland. And it was a memo from May 1972 about an 11-year-old girl who had been playing on the playground with what she thought was sidewalk chalk, which turned out to be congealed chemicals. And when she put her hands to her face, she was, as she said, blind. And so I find this in the archives in College Park, Maryland. It's a memo from people at Hooker Chemical back and forth to each other about this problem and what they should do about it. And meanwhile, you know, hundreds of miles away in a totally different archive, I find memos related to the same incident, but from the school district side. And I find those in Albany. And so now I have, you know, these basically 3 documents, like 6 pages. And you think, well, how can I write a really compelling, you know, 1,500 words from 3 pages, 6 pages, 3 documents? That seems impossible. But those documents had lots of details. You know, it had the name of the girl, it had her age, it had the date of the incident. Now I can take the date of the incident and I can go to the newspapers and find out what was the weather like that day in Niagara Falls. The fact that it had the name of the girl was crucial. The fact that it had her age, even more so. You know, women have a tendency to change their names, or at least they used to, which makes it a challenge for people like me to find them. And this girl did, in fact, get married a couple of times and change her name. But I had her age, and that helped me. And so I did ultimately find little 11-year-old Debbie Gallo, who was now in her 60s. And, you know, people have a tendency to forget lots of things. I don't remember what I did yesterday, But do you think an 11-year-old girl would remember the day that she thought she went blind and had to go to the hospital because she was playing with what she thought was sidewalk chalk? Absolutely, she remembered. And you know, who else would remember such a day? Well, her parents would. And one of them was still alive. And so now I interview Debbie and I interview her mother. And I've got these documents and I've got the newspaper articles, and boom, you know, you've got, you could probably write 6,000 words, right? But now you've got a great 1,500 words, you know, that reveals the scope of the problem without having to tell people there's a problem, you know? I think that's the other thing we need to do as storytellers, you know? It's one thing that David assuredly teaches in his journalism classes, and that, you know, all young journalists learn at some point, which is don't tell people, you know, so show them the story, show them, you know. So that's what I wanted to do in the opening pages of the book. And you need to be judicious about the details you choose to answer your question specifically. You know, when you do a research like this, you could go down tons of rabbit holes and get distracted by shiny objects over here and over here. You have to stay on what you're writing about, you know? And I feel like as storytellers, if we can say what we're writing about in 2 lines or less, then we know, you know? If a student comes to me and says, I'm thinking about writing about this thing, and then they talk about it for 7 minutes, I'm like, wow, you really don't know what you're writing about, you know? We should be able to tell ourselves what we're writing about in 2 lines or less. And if we can do that, then we can stay on our narrative path. And so for me, this was a story about a 2-year fight of people to escape their own homes, and how that fight changed the world. That's 1 line, you know. And so if it's about that, I'll include it. If it's not, I'm moving on.
Good advice for scientific writing too. We have time for one more question. I wonder if we have one more somewhere. Somebody wanted to ask.
I am always curious about how authors come up with the title of the book, and when in the process did you come up with the title?
It's amazing, you know. You write like 100,000 words on the inside of the book, and people tinker with those a little bit, and then you come to write the 8 words that are to appear on the cover, and suddenly there's like 25 cooks in the kitchen. So I didn't want to call the book Love Canal because I don't know, it felt I don't know, it felt odd. You know, you can make an argument that you could do it that way because then it's you know, it's a mysterious term and maybe you bring people in with that, but it's also mysterious in a way that maybe doesn't make people want to pick it up. So I was always drifting away from that. And, you know, as I said earlier, I was drawn to the notion that this was a certain paradise. This was like a suburban paradise. Who doesn't want to own the starter home 1 block from the brand new school with the large, expansive, rectangular playground? I mean, that is the suburban paradise that many people would want for their children, and certainly wanted in the 70s. You know? So I liked the idea that this was a certain paradise, but paradise falls. And so I very early on was drawn to that title. You'll see with the paperback that again, with many cooks in the kitchen, that they changed the subtitle for the paperback edition of the book, and changed the jacket as well. Paperback audiences tend to draw a different demographic of readers. You know, it's like I'll bring that to the beach. This is my book club read. And so if you come over to the book table, you'll see that that jacket and subtitle was designed maybe to try to capture that market a little bit more, because people do indeed judge books by their covers. In closing, I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank IGS for having me. Thank David and Stephanie for being a part of this, and mostly thank you for everything that you guys are doing here to tell your own stories of import at a time when those stories absolutely need to be told. So thank you so much for having me.
For taking the time to be with us in person here today. And so if you stick around, there's more conversation and also an opportunity to buy his book. It's right over there and get it signed perhaps.
And I have bookmarks, special
And there's
edition
special
bookmarks.
bookmarks.
You
Yeah,
can choose
thank
your
you,
favorite
everybody.
protagonist.